Little bit of an intro. I'm Frederick Starkey. Took the key from my partner's surname. There's a joke there, but I don't much care to repeat it. I consider myself a bit of an investigator, along with my duties as a curio collector. As the sole proprietor of the admittedly humble StarkeyCuriosities shop around Midtown Jackson, Wyoming, I come into your typical junk. Someone tries to see how much they can get for a glass eye molded from what is obviously plastic. Someone claims their grandma's spirit lives on in a thick, leather-bound book. Or most often, I get a shipment of cursed daggers with blades flimsier than spatulas that you can get at the Dollar Tree. The point is that I've acquired several sorts of peculiarities, enough to decorate the charcoal walls of my shop. I've even got some lawn gnomes scattered around. Supposedly, they create a protective aura. I suppose that's a good thing, considering my wares qualities. For all of you, I'd love to share my most interesting experience so far. It was a while ago, but I hope you'll forgive me for the delay. I sincerely wish that the gnomes were the most hair-raising thing about my occupation, but unfortunately, this side of Wyoming is home to some pretty interesting folk. It was a winter day, the 14th of January. I wish I could say that it was the day's events that inscribed the exact date in my mind, but in reality, I had the closest cafe to blame. They overcharged me for a cup of hot chocolate, and reading the receipt was the most annoyed I'd been in quite a while. The date, of course, was right at the top of the paper slip. As I nursed my lukewarm drink, I took some time to look around my shop. I set to work on tidying things up, though I thought that the level of dustiness really added to the place's overall vibe. Still, a half hour passed and the shop was half clean before I heard the high trinkle of the doorbell. I turned to the entrance and spotted a young man wearing a beanie and 3 layers of all blue clothing. He held a plastic bag in both of his hands, and he seemed to teeter from side to side with its weight. There's a strange prickle that comes to my neck whenever I sense that my day is about to get genuinely interesting. Beyond the typical definition of interesting, which is typically something like a father's careless response to an 8-year-old's newest drawing. Needless to say, I felt it as the man approached my counter and hoisted his bag up atop the wooden surface. I remember my childish thought at the crimson tip of his nose. Rudolph, I wanted to call him. He tucked the ginger lock back into his beanie, and he pushed his gloved hands deep into the bag. Right, sorry. Those were his first words to me. I should have taken it out. No rush. I remember mumbling as I kicked one of my gnomes aside. I had since decided that they were not for sale. The man unfurled the bag and revealed a steely box with a pattern of ridges. It was padlocked twice, and a golden key was taped to its top. I will transcribe what I remember of what he said, while trying to fill in the blanks from my own current assumptions. His statement was as follows. I know it looks like a lot, but I was trying to get it here safely. It's a watch. An ornate watch with some crystals in it. I've had them looked at. They're not just rhinestones. Listen to me, Mr. Starkey. At this point, his hands were on top of the box. He met my eyes. I can perfectly recall his next words. The time shown on this watch is never wrong. It will never lie. All it will do is play. It was at this point that I simply thanked him for his contribution and asked him to add his name to a list I kept on a clipboard. Lucas Clishern, his signature read. I'm looking at that very list as I type this out. I did not question his words, as my confirmation of the more intriguing item's abilities has nothing to do with another person's testimony. No, I give it a try for myself. I entirely accept the fact that I'm an idiot. I wish Mr. Clishern a good day and gave him a sum of $25 for his contribution to my shop. I promised to add more to the deal if it proved a worthwhile addition to my more permanent collection, which sat behind a glass pane at the back of my workspace. As he left, I peeled the tape off the box and twisted the key in both of the padlocks. They both clattered to the counter, and I unclamped the box. I pulled it open, feeling reminded of the briefcase from Pulp Fiction. A layer of white styrofoam protected a cloth-wrapped device. I pulled the cloth away and saw that Mr. Clishern's description had been an accurate one. In front of me, there sat a gold-strapped wristwatch, Red and blue studs were along the band, and as I pulled it out with ginger care, I could tell that a layer of quartz separated me from the watch's ticking hands. It was accurate to the second. If it wasn't so seemingly cursed, it could have been worth an incredible amount. It was a great improvement to the Power Rangers watch I had owned since I was 11 years old. I pulled my sleeve back and donned the watch, admiring its detail for most of my uneventful shift. A few customers came in to browse and left without buying anything, which was customary. Sensible people still exist, I suppose. Anyway, I closed up and made my way back home. I felt the same hunger that greeted me at the end of my shift. Without a watch, I'd usually use my stomach's grumble as a clock chime to tell me it was time to get home. I dined well that night. My partner had made shepherd's pie. I slept. I woke. My watch told me the time, still accurate to my phone. If I may summarize, my life went along as usual for 3 days. I had taken to cross-referencing the watch with my phone by the second. The 18th of January came along, and my watch was about a half hour slow. That was also the morning when I realized that there were no knobs or buttons on the watch. The watch was 30 minutes off, and that was a simple fact. Nevertheless, it was about time to open up my shop. I drove over and did the deed, after getting a latte from a more trustworthy cafe. I stepped inside, flipped the closed sign around to an open one, and took my place behind the counter. I spent the first few minutes of the day dusting the gnome that stood by my side. I was bored, and he was looking more unsightly than usual. 2 people bought daggers that day. One of them told me that she sensed its aura. Well, you can sense all you want, as long as you're buying. An older man gave me a chipped teapot that had apparently survived since the 20s. Once owned by a family who were killed in their dining room by a meteor strike. Nasty way to go. I gave him 30 for it. His story honestly won me over. It was a local tale, and I intended to do more research on it. I knew that the library carried newspapers from every year of the town's past. I didn't check my watch, but my stomach grumbled, and I knew what that meant. I figured that I would stop by at home before I went to research the meteor strike. As I arrived, my partner, I neglected to say, Danny, piqued my interest with a question. Apparently, I was nearly 2 hours late. I simply said that I had lost track of time, which was not entirely false. It was an interesting thought. As we ate, the questions pestered my mind. If my watch was 30 minutes slow, how could I have been 2 hours late? Moreover, my hunger was downright Pavlovian, so it was beyond me as to how it possibly could have failed me. I punished it with an extra helping of dessert and went off to the library, which was, predictably, closed as soon as I arrived. I considered removing the watch when I went to bed that night, but I felt that it would have been a massive impedance to my research on its supposed curse. So far, it mainly seemed like some screwy machinery. In the next few days, its slowness was increased at 5-minute intervals. I came back home later and later, but decided that the cutoff time was sundown, hunger pangs or not. I could eat without being in starvation mode, so it was more of a nuisance than a genuine problem. I got home, I ate, I went to bed, as was my increasingly unscheduled routine. That morning was when the watch began to speed up. I turned my morning drink into a takeout breakfast, and I stood behind the counter with a latte and a croissant sandwich with a side of hash browns. It did well to satiate the throbs of hunger and thirst that clawed at my stomach, my throat. I made sure to discard my waste before any customers arrived. Eating while on the job is uncouth, which is annoying. It's my shop. I should be allowed to make my own rules. The day ended when my phone said so. Damn the watch. I didn't expect Danny to pick me up that day. Well, to be frank, I also didn't expect to swerve into a ditch because of a sudden spell of sleep while driving home. A raw, animal hunger beat at my ribcage as Danny carried me to the front door, and I made my way to the fridge before I even explained anything to him. I shoveled shredded mozzarella into my stomach, barely aware of how disgusting the sight would have been. My eyes were lidded. Every motion felt like my joints were attached to 50-pound dumbbells. I staggered and fell against the counter before Danny could finally get my attention. He asked me what on earth was going on. Like an idiot, I claimed that I didn't know. like an idiot. When he carried me off to bed, I told him I'd be fine to work tomorrow. The next day, felt like every fifth blink gave me a minute or two of sound sleep. I sat at the counter with a huge bag of trail mix and a gallon jug of water. I drained the entire jug when I was halfway through my shift, and I felt this tingle, this tightness around my hands. Every time I looked down to see what it was about, my body slumped and I slept. My tongue turned to taffy, and my lips were crusted as I shoveled trail mix into my mouth. I was blessed with very few customers that day. Very few people to look at my sunken countenance and recoil. I yawned at closing time and got up to change the sign to closed. As I was 5 steps away from the door, my legs gave out. I woke up with a bloody nose, sprawled out in the back of Danny's car. A rolled tissue was stuffed into one of my nostrils. I reached up to brush the sweat from my brow. The back of my hand was leather. I struggled to clasp my fingers, to bring my hand into my view. I squinted and looked over the bumpy, taut skin. My veins were thick tubes that nearly tore through ghostly flesh. My knuckles turned to awful, knobby things. I inhaled and braced myself to scream, but I only slept. I woke up when we reached the driveway, and my chest tightened at the sound of Danny's sobs, muffled by his sleeve. I thought he would have been used to this part of my work. I tried to speak his name through my sandpaper throat, but all that came out was a raspy breath. My fingers trembled so violently as I reached for my wrist. I touched the quartz shield of the watch, and I fell back asleep. I forced my eyes back open, and I dangled in Danny's arms. I squinted up at him and parted my lips. Again, no luck. I reached to my wrist with more force and pinched the watch's strap. With a wheezing grunt, I undid it. I caught the watch and, with unsure fingers, stuffed it into Danny's jacket pocket. I sat up on the sofa and smacked my scaly lips together. A glass of water sat on the coffee table. I reached out with my weathered fingers and downed it. My tongue stung at the departure from the pure desert dryness. I set the glass down with a sense of finality and stood, my knees wobbly. I called for Danny and asked if he kept the watch. He had. Good, I said. My body had seen the effects of countless curses. My back's flayed skin would tell you as much, as would the ridiculous number of hospital visits I've avoided by marrying a surgeon. At the end of it all, it just so happened that the watch would be worth keeping around. I gave Mr. Lucas Clichern an extra $30 for his excellent contribution.